I'm here to talk to you about unlocking long-term relevance in a short-form world, the short-form world that we find ourselves living in here today. Let me start by saying I believe we have a sawdust problem. I don't want to alarm you, but before I talk about that, I have a couple questions for you. Show of hands, I want you to think about one of the favorite things that you've ever made and tell me, was that a social media post? Okay. Now think about the thing that you've made that other people reference the most. Show of hands. Was that a social media post? One last question. Who's anxious right now thinking about your next social media post? Look around at the hands. Isn't that interesting? Isn't that interesting how much time we spend creating, consuming, and thinking about the work that we probably won't remember a week from now, even our own work. It may not be our favorite work, it may not be our most popular work, and yet, it may be our most time-consuming or even anxiety-producing work. Now, you may be like Justin Moore back in his MXPX days, and you're thinking, that's nice, Jay, but we have to do social media in 2023. Because if you're not on TikTok, if you're not on Instagram, if you're not on YouTube Shorts, if you're not on Twitter or even LinkedIn, do you even exist? Well, there are two things that I believe. One is that social media and short-form work is useful. And I also believe that some creators do their best work in social media and in short form. I'm not saying social media or short form bad or not useful or not good, but I think maybe we're overemphasizing it. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. Recently, I was listening to a podcast between James Clear and Ryan Hawk. Great show. Give Ryan Hawk's Learning Leader a listen. That's where this came from. And James said this really smart thing, as he tends to do. He said, what is the work that keeps working for me once it is done? He used this as an example. He said, I don't do radio interviews anymore. Because once you do radio and that airs, it no longer does any work for me. After the radio snippet runs, the people who were listening to it, they had a good experience, they heard it, but then it's gone. And short form is almost like radio. In a lot of ways, it is. Yes, the things you make in short form and on social media, they continue to exist technically. Nothing on the internet is forgotten. But do you continue to feel the impact of that reel that you posted a year ago? I don't know. What is the work that keeps working for me once it's done? Now, he went on to say, if you think about this, the impact is you end up with a bunch of different versions of James out there doing work for you on your behalf, and they're doing it 24/7 with very little maintenance and no pay, which is pretty great. It harkens back to what Nathan was saying about the flywheel that you're creating as a creator. Now, if you know James's work, he published Atomic Habits in 2018. What you may not know is that in 2021, it was the best-selling book on Amazon. Not a best-selling book. It was the best-selling book on Amazon 3 years after it was published. James is an exceptional example, but I don't think that James is an exception. If we think about other books, just for example, Steal Like an Artist, that comes up in conversation all the time. The War of Art, who here has heard of The Resistance? I think we've all heard of it. I think we've all experienced it. The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, The E-Myth Revisited, How to Win Friends and Influence People. These are books that we're probably still hearing about all the time as creators. This concept isn't just about books. It's not just about authors. It applies to ideas. Simon Sinek's Wait But Why speech, which is actually called How Great Leaders Inspire Action, learn that in this presentation, and his corresponding book. But that was an idea at first. It applies to frameworks. You've probably heard of Joseph Campbell's Hero's Journey. It applies to methods. You might have heard of the Feynman technique of learning something. All of these things are assets. Assets retain or appreciate in value. Are short-form posts assets? Maybe some of them. Maybe some of them continue to get resurfaced and you get traction from it, and it's a good investment. But now consider the blog posts you've made, or YouTube videos you've made, or courses you've made, or email courses that you've made. I bet the hit rate's a little bit higher of these feeling like assets for you. Now, if we go a step further, I think one of the greatest assets you can create, or a way of thinking about the greatest assets that you can create, is intellectual property. If you're not familiar with the term, legalese, don't blame you, don't worry. Webster's dictionary says a work or invention that is the result of creativity, such as a manuscript or a design, to which one has rights and for which one may apply for a patent, copyright, trademark. In 1938, Steamboat Willie first made his appearance. 1941, the first Captain America Marvel comic book. Walt Disney is no longer with us, unfortunately. Neither is Stan Lee of Marvel. And yet, Disney World, still going along. Jay, still wearing the sweater. Marvel movies, pumping out all the time. One of the most successful, valuable franchises on the planet. Huge businesses are built on intellectual property. And yes, books are still a great way to create leverage and distribute intellectual property. Here's the other great thing about intellectual property, though. Other people go on to share it on your behalf. I mentioned a minute ago the Feynman technique. Sahil Bloom in the audience here somewhere. When he goes and talks about the Feynman technique, that is still value and equity being attributed to Feynman himself, right? Shane Parrish of the Knowledge Project, he wrote an article on the Feynman technique. Dr. Feynman creates a technique, doesn't have to do all the legwork forever sharing that technique because it resonates. It makes sense. People use it. They now have a common language. They have a way to describe this. They share it on his behalf. That brings equity and value back to him. There's no additional work on his part, but there is huge additional upside. Now, you may be thinking, social media wasn't around then, or James Clear still uses social media. And you're right. James is on Twitter. He's on Instagram. He's even on LinkedIn. But that came after the book. I actually went back into Social Blade and looked at this. Around the time of the release of the book, James had about 100,000 Twitter followers, not small. But he was not using Instagram. He's just on LinkedIn a couple months ago. Which brings us back to the sawdust problem. In 2020, Jack Butcher put out this thread. It was great. He said, sell your sawdust. The concept of selling sawdust is simply sharing the byproduct of your work. The fidelity of your ideas increases as you share them. If this metaphor is not clear yet, let me tell you about my dad. My dad is a woodworker. He makes beautiful, phenomenal pieces of work. He's not great with iPhones, though, so give me some slack on the fidelity of the photos. Furniture is beautiful. My wife took that photo. That's why it looks so good. Sawdust is the natural byproduct of the work he does in the shop. It's the natural byproduct of creating something beautiful. This idea is what built the build in public movement. When you build in public, when you're creating something great, it comes with a couple of things. It comes with lessons learned from the process. It comes with ideas that you had in the process that you scrapped. They didn't make it into the final product. Maybe it didn't make it into a chapter of the book or into the final edit on YouTube, but you still think it's interesting, so you want to share it elsewhere. Challenges that came up along the way and how you solved them, the way you triumphed over those challenges. Sawdust is useful and valuable, but it's probably not as useful and valuable as new kitchen cabinets, right? Now, to go back to James for a second, if you look at the way he shows up on social media, you see that he's sharing an excerpt from his book. He's sharing an idea from his newsletter. That's where he's investing the bulk of his time and attention, is into these assets. He's creating his own James flywheel. This is how it's working. And that looks a little bit like this. You have the book at the top. That drives content for social media, which drives people into his newsletter, which creates an audience of people that know, like, and trust him, that he can reach reliably. He owns that asset that is his email list. He can encourage those people to check out the book. Maybe Atomic Habits 2 when it comes out. Don't think that's actually a thing, but you can imagine if it was. This ecosystem, this flywheel, is why his book was the bestseller on Amazon in 2021. Now, a lot of people don't have an Atomic Habits. They don't know what that thing is for them yet, but they want to start creating. And so they look first at social media. But unfortunately, when you don't have the thing, there's nothing driving towards what you create on social media. Social media becomes the thing that you focus your time on creating, and you hope that's building an audience of people who know, like, and trust you, and you can encourage to buy your thing. But what is that thing? It's confusing. And suddenly, sawdust isn't the byproduct. Sawdust is the product. And we're on this treadmill of just generating sawdust, and people look at it and it's interesting. They're like, oh, sawdust is valuable, but what made that sawdust? Now, in my dad's shop, he has a machine that collects sawdust. Literally collects it. It's not interesting to him. He says, get rid of this crap. I wanted to know if my dad actually felt this way about sawdust. Quick aside. So I texted him yesterday. I said, Dad, what's your opinion on sawdust? He responded with a thumbs up emoji to the text. No follow-up. I say, is that it? You like sawdust? He says, I'm in the middle of Lake Erie. You want an essay? Which he follows up with, just caught a nice walleye. Okay, great, Dad. It's a good-looking fish. Now you may be thinking, okay, but I made all this sawdust. What if I just glue it all together into something bigger? Could go well, could go poorly. Put this in here because I looked up, like, what happens when you put sawdust all together? And they're like, well, you put it with glue and it makes a paste. And I thought, aha, paste. Yes, you can do that. In carpentry, when you take the sawdust and put it together, you end up with something called particle board. This is what particle board looks like. Not exactly the most beautiful or enduring end product. You probably aren't going to be the master carpenter well known for your work if you're making everything out of particle board. So I'm here to encourage you to flip the scales. Right now, you may be spending a lot of time thinking about working on creating short-term work and not thinking as much about the long-term enduring work, not thinking so much about assets, about intellectual property. So let's flip that. Let's instead spend more time thinking about the things that we're making, how they're enduring, the value they'll create for our business long-term. If we stepped away from the keyboard, if we didn't film a short-form vertical video right now, what would happen? Would our business go quiet? That's a telltale sign that you need to flip these scales a little bit. Adopt a woodworker's mentality. My dad likes sawdust, sure, granted. He doesn't mind sawdust, but he's not out there manufacturing sawdust. He is focusing on bigger creative projects. He is creating long-term assets. And if you do that, you'll watch and see sawdust begin to appear. Thanks.